But welcome to everyone, and a huge welcome and thank you to Tom. This is an exciting one. This is the very first US property that we worked with at Stanley Wines. Started the company 16 years ago, and I think it was about 14 or 15 years ago that we turned up at a generic tasting. There were 200, 250 wines at it, and there was Cristom. We knew nothing about it. What was in the glass hit us firmly in the face, and it was fabulous. We managed to lure them away from that importer, and we've loved the wines ever since then. In a way, I think Tom will expand on this for us, but that's understandable in that Dujac was one of the very first Burgundy domains that we worked with. And as Tom will tell you, there's a strong connection between Cristom and Dujac. So we'll come on to that. But tonight, a few things we're hopefully going to enjoy ourselves and learn from tonight. And Tom is going to tell us the story of Cristom. He's now taken over from his father and is firmly in charge. So we'll hear about the history of Cristom. We've got the chance to really dig deep into the different vineyards tonight and learn about the different characteristics, where they're situated, and why that contributes to how they taste. Ageability, what are their characteristics? We're going to learn about that. And also two vintages we're looking at tonight. We're releasing the 18 vintage at the moment, but we've got the chance to taste some of the 17s next to them as well. So I'm going to ask Tom to talk about those two vintages. And as always, really appreciate questions. Tom is more than happy to be interrupted. So fire anything via a text message. I will read it and interrupt Tom on your behalf. But thank you, and over to you, Tom.
Well, it is my great pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for having me. It's been a fantastic relationship, you know, that we've been able to have together over these last 15 years, as you said. And gosh, you've opened some doors for us, and we can't thank you enough for that. But it's been a brilliant relationship and partnership. I guess just a quick introduction. Is my mother and father started Cristom Vineyards in 1992. And my mother and father honored my sister and I by naming it after the two of us. So my older sister is Christine, and I'm Tom. My father then went on to name the individual properties after the matriarchs in the family, the women in the family. Eileen, my mother, that we'll get to taste today, Jessie and Louise, my great-grandmothers, and Marjorie, my grandmother. So they began the vineyard in 1992, really with a vision to try to grow world-class Pinot Noir. From the get-go, it was to try to grow benchmark Pinot Noir. At the time, my father we were living in the East Coast of the US. We were living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And my father was mostly drinking Burgundies, but he was also drinking a few California Pinot Noirs. And one in particular was from Calera. And upon buying the property and starting the property in 1992, he began conversations with the winemaker at Calera, Steve Dorner. And at the time, Steve was looking for a change, and we began working together. Our family and his family began working together from the get-go in 1992. So Steve has been with us from the very, very beginning. And so with that really wonderful introduction, and thank you, Steve's style is very much rooted and based, and his philosophies very much based on his time and visits with Jacques Sez at Dujac. And so in the 1980s, he was able to visit a number of times with Jacques, and that helped form and cement really his belief on how the land should make the wine, and that the influence of the very difficult decision, the very difficult philosophy to have a hands-off winemaking style, to have the deliberate decision to not intervene and then to incorporate whole clusters into the winemaking. And so, you know, from the get-go here at Cristom, it has been about trying to grow something as well as it can be grown in the world today, and then trying to make a wine from these places, from these sites, these individual sites that have personality all to themselves, coupled with this style, coupled with these philosophies of hands-off, non-interventionist winemaking, very, very low impact, native yeast, whole clusters, gentle press, straight to barrel by gravity, with little to no racking, and egg white fining and to bottle. I mean, sorry to oversimplify things, but it's about coupling that philosophy with these pieces of ground. And I just would also quickly say that the wines that my father and myself and Steve Dorner probably have most connected over the years, over you know, our years working together and time together over the last few decades has been over Dujac, and specifically Clos Saint-Denis and Clos de Vougeot, which we see as the benchmarks for the world for Pinot Noir today, and really for the last 3 decades. I mean, some of my all-time favorite wines have been, you know, from 90, 95, 96, 99, you know, Clos Saint-Denis, Clos de Vougeot. So it's been the better part of 3 decades that we see it as the absolute benchmark and pinnacle for the world, and what we are striving to be to farm. Our farming, I think, and is striving to be in that same conversation for benchmarks for a region. So I know we're gonna talk today a lot about the individual sites and properties. You know, I don't know if you'd like to maybe jump right into that now, and we can begin talking about the individual places. But,
on that note, exactly. First wine we've got tonight is the 18 Jessie. Kicking off with that one.
So Jessie Vineyard is named after a great grandmother of mine. Jessie is one of the steepest vineyards in all of Oregon. We are picking actually one of the steepest blocks in Oregon today, actually, as we speak. It's about 35% slope. So dramatically steep. It's like farming on a ski slope. The impacts that we have on this is it's due east facing, rather phenomenal elevation shift. You know, almost 250 feet in elevation shift. It has rather roaring winds, and we're going to talk today quite a bit about wind, but you know, it gets a really strong winds that come off the Pacific Ocean through an area called the Van Duzer Corridor, which I'm going to say a few times today. It's a small gap in the coastal mountain range along the Pacific coast. It's about 1.5 miles long that creates a wind funnel, and it is directly west from us. We are due east of this, and these winds come off the Pacific Ocean and absolutely roar. The vines can really shut down at night, really hang on to their acidity. Acidity helps dictate our picking. It's one of our most important markers for picking, and we get phenomenal acidity here. Very, very low pH, very, very high acid. And Jessie is no different than that. It also is dramatic in its soil profile. So it has sort of some of the most shallow volcanic soils that we have here in the Willamette Valley, and actually some of the deepest soils that we have, volcanic soils that we have here in the Willamette Valley. You know, ranging, you know, from 20 inches to 100 inches of topsoil. So we have to farm these blocks very, very, very differently. You can perhaps imagine that just 20 inches of soil, there's different canopy management, different cover crops, different soil management than an area with 100 inches of soil where we have to slow that vigor down. It's actually too vigorous in those areas. So Jessie has a little bit of it all. Brilliant elevation, this dramatic steep slope, due east facing, all morning sun, sheltered from the harsher afternoon rays, brilliant acidity. The telltale markers of Jessie, for Steve and I, we've commented on this for years in the cellar. And Jessie, perhaps at Cristom, more than any other single vineyard, perhaps has more personality, has more signature than any other place, than any other piece of ground. There's a savoriness to it, a meatiness, an umami. There's a savoriness to I think the stem inclusion, the stem character specifically here. But there's also a floral quality here in Jessie that I find year after year, vintage after vintage, that's very different than the floral aromatics of any other part of the farm. The aromatics in Jessie are much more about blue flower, purple flower, lilac, and lavender. You know, we see a lot more classic rose, crushed rose, you know, pink flowers in Eileen and in Marjorie. But we do not see this sort of pretty pronounced lilac really anywhere else on the farm. And so it really has that as a signature that really comes through nearly barrel after barrel. It's not even, it's an 11.5 acre vineyard. It's you know, there's, it doesn't even really seem to be from the really shallow soils or the really deep soils. But we are, you know, trying to learn more and more and more about every single parcel on the farm. And you know, one thing I just would quickly say before we jump on about Jessie is it's really truly testament. It's the parcel of ground that if we ever get the chance to walk together on the Cristom farm, it's where I always like to talk about our crew. You know, we have 16 men and women that work year round on the vineyard and then on the farm here. And I mean, you can be out of breath walking up this vineyard. And so to have the dedication that our crew has of 20 and 22 touches per vine per year, you know, it's phenomenal. Just in Jessie alone, you know, there's over 25,000 vines, just in Jessie. And, you know, to be doing that at 30%, 35% grade over 20 times a year is, it's phenomenal dedication from our people. And, you know, our crew averages, you know, over 9 years, working just here at Cristom, for each of those 16 men and women. So maybe I'll take a breath and let you ask a question.
A general one on winemaking throughout the different vineyards. A question on whole cluster. Is it 100% or does it vary from vineyard to vineyard and vintage to vintage? And then whilst we're there, we might as well throw in new oak. Does that vary vineyard to vineyard, vintage to vintage, or does it tend to be fairly consistent?
So fantastic question. So I think with a whole bunch, with our whole cluster inclusion, it is, it's not 100%. The average blend for the Cristom wines are typically closer to 45 or 50%. We may have as many as 100 different open top red wine fermentations, any given vintage, varying in sizes from 1 ton to 7 tons, all in open tops. And every single fermenter might have a little varying bit of whole cluster percentage, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%. in that range across every single fermenter. And so then the average typically ends up being about 45 or 50% whole bunch. Now, how we determine that is really based on vintage. It's really based on bloom. It's really based on set. It's really based on the historical, working with specific blocks and the history with those blocks. It's really about, I think just using vintages specifically, when we have looser, lighter set, we don't want to have a higher percentage of whole cluster in some of those years because, we're really thinking about that juice to stem ratio, that skin to stem ratio. That's important. We absolutely have 100% whole cluster fermentations in the winery each year. There are a number of them, usually to always look at that impact. I think that for Steve and I, it's something we love, but it's maybe not the best thing for the American consumer right out the gate. It's maybe a little bit more difficult to understand. I think it's better for maybe a wine that is more meant for aging. I do think the whole clusters, which we can talk about at any point, I do think the whole clusters and our picking decision with acid, those things coupled together lead to pretty tremendous aging in the wines. I think 100% whole cluster can be a bit, at least here in Oregon, where sometimes we don't get the sun and length of time that we always want. We don't quite get the lignification that we always want.
Do you therefore dial it right down on Mount Jefferson for earlier drinking?
Well, Mount Jefferson Cuvée is really made in the exact same style as the single vineyards. Mount Jefferson Cuvée, which we're not tasting right now today, but it's really the foundation of Cristom, and it's the heart and soul of what we do, and it's made in the same way as the single vineyards. Quickly about new wood, typically new wood is 40 to 50% in the single vineyards, maybe 20% in the Mount Jefferson Cuvée. Mount Jeff is in barrel a year. Single vineyards are in barrel for 18 months. Those are the biggest differences stylistically. But Mount Jefferson Cuvée is a blend. It's 100% Pinot Noir, but it's a blend from, I was saying earlier, we may have as many as 100 different open top red wine, Pinot Noir fermentations. Mount Jefferson Cuvée is essentially a barrel or so from every single one of those 100 fermentations. And so it's made in the exact same way with native yeast, open top fermentation, punch down 3 times a day, and that same whole cluster of 30 to 60% across all of the ferments. So the Mount Jeff whole cluster percentage is typically 45% or so as well. So I do think Steve and I typically choose barrels that are bright and fresh, and we do, most of Mount Jefferson Cuvée is sold on restaurant wine lists, so that is in mind when we make that blend, absolutely. But I do think Mount Jefferson is underrated for how well it can age. Is my long-winded way to say that, is that I think Mount Jefferson Cuvée is actually built to last, just like the single vineyards are, but maybe not given the chance or credit that it deserves sometimes.
So we ought to press on to the Louise 18. If we can get into it now as we're tasting the second wine, the ageability of the wines. I've been lucky enough to taste Cristom with 15 years bottle age in it and think, wow, yeah, this has got 10 years plus still to go. Is that something you actually set out to do? Is that a function of the vineyards? You tell me about the ageability of the wines and what your thoughts are, please.
Well, I think it comes back to a little bit of the base and vision, the foundation and vision of who we are. We're trying to grow something that's as well as it can be grown in North America, as well as it can be grown in the world. I think a marker for that, I think one point, if you want to be trying to do that, I think your wines need to age. And I think that they should be good at the gate, but I think that they should have the opportunity to age and be appreciated over time, and to my palate, get significantly better over time. So I think that's in part what we're setting out to do. I think it's in part just inherent in the philosophy of the winemaking style. I think picking based on low pH, very high acid, the whole cluster inclusion, typically pretty balanced alcohols with our picking decisions, lead to great ageability in the wine. I really think that's it. Really, to me, the ageability of wine comes down to basically 4 factors. The tannin, the acid, and that structure together, that balance, the intensity of the fruit, and the balance of the alcohol. And if those things are in great balance, I think you're setting yourself up for the opportunity for a good wine to become great. And I think great sites do that as well. And again, I think that's based on our vision too. We're trying to grow something really, based on a place. We're trying to have our wines be an honest reflection of a place in time, a specific piece of ground in time. And I think great pieces of ground do that. I think age. I do. I believe that. So
we'd better get on to talking about.
Of course, excuse me. I apologize. I can go. I apologize. Excuse me. Okay. So quickly, 18. We're now trying our second 18 here. 18 was a dry vintage here. We have been in a little bit of a spell and a pattern over the last several years of having less rainfall. Typically, we are pretty fortunate with more than 40 inches of rain a year, but this was much drier than that. And I think that it led to some intensity to the fruit, which has been really, really pleasing. And I think what we tried to do was also try to retain and capture some of that natural acidity. I think the trick here with this vintage was to not allow that acidity to fall away, but to retain that, but to pick, when the acid was high enough, pH low enough to retain some of that in the bottle. With it being so dry, the vineyard wanted to desiccate. We needed to protect the very small berries, and the vineyard wanted to stress. And so it can drop out its acid rather quick at the end. And so, but mostly was pleased with our picking decisions and our timing. Louise Vineyard is unique on the Cristom estate because it is our lowest slopes on the hillside, and it actually has a little bit like Jessie. It has very dynamic volcanic soil throughout the majority of the vineyard. But then it also has a tiny bit of actually ancient sedimentary soil from ancient seafloor, 60 million year old sedimentary soil. And then there's also, a little swath of Missoula flood sediments from the end of the last ice age. So it's this really sort of fascinating mix of soils where you have 60 million year old sedimentary, you have 13 to 15 million year old volcanic, you have 13 to 15,000 year old Missoula flood silts, Missoula flood sediments. And so we're farming these areas very, very differently, really based on the soil. It's a piece of ground that has, it really kind of has it all. It has this combination of soils. It has a beautiful east-facing steep slope that is some of really the finest fruit to come off of the farm. And then it has this nice upper bench with really deep volcanic soil. It's just absolutely beautiful. Names of soils here you possibly have heard of, but Gerrie and Nikaya, which are two of our favorite soils to farm in here. But then it also has this large forest that surrounds the entire western edge of the vineyard. And that forest, we talked a little bit about the wind in Jessie and how I mean, it can be pretty tremendous wind. And when we talk about Eileen, it's even more pronounced. But we can get, 20, 25 mile an hour gusts of wind on a nightly basis, particularly in Eileen and also in Jessie. Well, this forest really protects Louise from that wind. It's so much more calm in the Louise vineyard, and it's very still. And it's very impactful, actually. I think on the acids in the fruit here. They typically, Louise then can typically be a little bit more round in its profile. It can have a little bit more of a softer edge, whereas I think there's a little bit more of a finer line, more of a racier line with Jessie and Eileen and Marjorie. Louise can have a little bit more plushness, can be a little bit rounder. I think that's exemplified here in this drier vintage. Drier vintages can present themselves in the glass a little bit like a warmer vintage. So 18 was not necessarily warm. It was sort of average in its temperatures, average in its highs and lows, average in its growing degree days, but it can present itself actually quite like an intensely warm vintage due to how the vines were stressing at the end, because it was so dry. But Louise, also its characteristics are some of the most mixed fruit profile on anywhere on the Cristom estate, because it has sedimentary soil, because it has some of the deepest volcanic soil. Really quickly about that, overgeneralizing, but a decent generalization. Volcanic soils, specifically deep volcanic soils, are brighter, higher toned, more red fruited. They're more about strawberries and cherries and just bright fruit and bright floral aromatics. Shallow volcanic soils and sedimentary soils they're more blue in their fruit, purple in their fruit profile, black in their fruit profile. They can be a little bit more intense in their structure and their tannin profile and their tannin structure. And so within Louise, you have extremely deep volcanic soil, which is bright and red toned and red fruited. And you have this sedimentary, you have these, this sedimentary at the lowest part of the hillside that actually can be rather intense in its structure, rather intense in its tannin profile, and sort of a dark, almost blackberry in its fruit profile.
For your question here, Tom, I can partially, it's a question something I was thinking of partially, I can answer partially. Have you considered making a wine from particular barrels? I remember in the past, we used to buy the signature wine from you, which I think was a barrel selection. You haven't released that for some time. Was that a philosophy change? Is it something you will go back to? What are your thoughts there?
Signature was, I really thought a really neat concept. It was meant to be a barrel selection. It was 2 or 3 barrels. We only did it a few times, a handful of times. 1998 was the first release. We did it in 2004, 2005, 2008. 2012 and 2014. So it was a limited release wine. To be honest with you, where I really want to focus and the focus of Cristom moving forward, I guess one thing I should have said in my introduction is, I've been here now, this is now my 14th year. I took over ownership of Cristom 8 years ago. And so have been leading things here for the better part of the last decade. And I have been crafting, over the last 5 years plus 10, what I now am sort of calling what my CEO, Steve Thompson, helped me phrase, which is the 100-year vision of Cristom Vineyards. Where is Cristom Vineyards going to be 100 years from now? So the decisions that I make, the decisions with which I lead, the vision with which I lead is with that in mind. What is Cristom going to be doing 100 years from now? I have a young son. It's my hope that I will be able to set things up that when I'm ready 30 plus years from now, that I'd be able to hand things over and he'd be able to take this on another generation. That is a hope of mine. I want things to be able to be set up that if he so chooses, that if he wants that he could go after that. I say all that to say the vision of Cristom and what I want it moving forward. Steve Dorner has helped bring a philosophy of winemaking here. But Steve is not always going to get to be here. He's going to retire. He's in his mid-60s. But that philosophy will stay. We have hired a new winemaker, which we can tie into our conversation later. But we've hired Daniel Estrin out of Literai. He's been working with Ted Lemon at Literai for 7 years, to join Steve, to join me, to join our winemaking team, and to also help learn these philosophies and learn what we're doing here, to then help carry it on. What I am going to be doing is carrying Steve's style, Steve's philosophy on through me for the next number of decades. And part of that philosophy and style is about trying to make a wine from a piece of ground. And so I loved the concept of the signature. That was very, very cool, and it was very limited. But I want the philosophy to be more rooted in these vineyards. I have planted a new vineyard over the last 6 years and named it after my father, now called the Paul Gerrie Vineyard. It's now our largest planting on the farm. And one day will be the single biggest contributor to Mount Jefferson Cuvée. And so what I want Mount Jefferson Cuvée to be is an even greater expression of the Eola-Amity Hills, but also of this hillside, this whole entire hillside. And so really the future of what Mount Jefferson Cuvée is going to be is really based on two pillars, two vineyard foundational pillars, Eileen Vineyard and Paul Gerrie Vineyard off the Cristom estate. And so the two vineyards named after my mother, Eileen, and my father, Paul Gerrie, are going to be the two core wines, the two core vineyards that are what Mount Jefferson Cuvée is built off of, what our flagship wine, what our foundational wine is built off of.
With the mention of Eileen, I should probably steer us on to wine number 3, the 18 Eileen.
Yeah, excuse me.
It's all, keep going, it's all good. Please do tell us about Eileen, situation, characteristics, what should we expect? Is this a classic Eileen we've got here in the 18?
So Eileen Vineyard is at the very top of our hillside. And, we talked a little bit about Van Duzer corridor. It's worth mentioning we're in the Eola-Amity Hills. Eola is the Greek word for wind. So we are quite literally in the wind hills of the Willamette Valley. And Eileen is true testament to that. The wind absolutely roars across this vineyard. When the afternoon picks up and those cooling breezes off the Pacific Ocean come in, it's rather fantastic. And it's very, very impactful on these vines. Very high elevation here, goes over 700 feet in elevation. But there is nothing in between the Pacific Ocean and Van Duzer corridor and Eileen that's higher in elevation to slow this wind down. It's a straight shot and no hillsides or anything in between. So the defining characteristics of the wine is often about its acid. It's often about the natural acidity in the wine. It's often about the high-toned, very pretty fruit characteristics. Often very, very strawberry, raspberry, cherry. It's also very similar in what I was saying to Jessie in its soil composition. So this, we have a couple soil pits in Eileen right now that are rather dramatic. This really does have soil. There's it's over 10 feet. There's 120 inches of topsoil in one of the soil pits, and it's mapped as Gerrie. But you know, Gerrie is thought to be greater than 60 inches of topsoil. This is twice that. This is 120 inches of topsoil. It's incredible. So again, with that type of depth, the soil, the roots can get very deep. A lot of access to water, but typically what we're seeing in soils like this is very pretty, very, very, very bright fruit. You know, very, very red fruited. But Eileen is very blessed, very benefited by these ridges. There's two primary ridges of just wicked rocks that you know, you get into with a shovel. And so, I mean, it's almost just barely inches of topsoil before you get into rocks. Before you get into rocks that are size of baseballs, and you know, I mean, and then you're into boulders very, very, very quickly. Massive boulders, rather. And so again, we have to farm these areas very, very differently, row by row, section by section, because just the wicked rocks, it creates very, very stressed vines, very small canopies. We can't have any cover crop at all. We have to, you know, cultivate everything in those areas, in-row cultivate in those areas. And the wines can be dark and intense and brooding, very spicy, black fruited. And so you can have a really nice mix in Eileen of a push and pull of dark and red fruit, but the foundation is really red fruit with these accents of something spicier and darker and more just sort of I guess masculine. But really the acid is a defining quality that we see with this vineyard. And I think with 18, you know, it is fairly classic for us. But the 18s are, and we'll talk about this a little bit as we transition now into the 17s, but the 18 and 17 vintages are very, very different vintages. And so I think you're going to see that, hopefully see that in, you know, trying these two vintages side by side, but also see some of the common threads as well. But it's a little darker. It's an intense, and it's young. As you said, this is a baby. This is an absolute infant. This was just released. So an absolute infant. This was just bottled in April, earlier this year.
And of the three vineyards we've tasted tonight, there was any one of them, is it more showy in youth? Is anyone you expect to age, need more time? Where would you comment on that?
Well, I think typically with Louise, it can take a little bit more time to open up. I think with all of these, you're rewarded if you can you know, wait a short amount of time. You know, the typical American consumer, we joke here, you know, ages their wine in the back seat of their car on their way home from the grocery store. You know, I don't encourage that. I encourage patience if you can. But I think for me anyway, Eileen and Jessie may be the most long-lived, at least just even from my initial tastings over the last several months, and even maybe affirmed by today. But I think I really like the acid structure in those two wines. There's quite a bit of structure here in Eileen, actually, for being so high on elevation. Typically, our more delicate vineyard as opposed to Louise. It's just really nice. It's got a nice frame. I really like the skeleton, and I just look forward to seeing how it fleshes out. I look forward to seeing how it picks up some weight. It needs to pick up a little mid palate and a little bit in the finish, but it's nice. It's a really nice start. It's a really, really nice frame.
So the 17 vintage. Going on to Jessie.
So let me open this really, really quickly. Excuse me. So the 17 vintage, perhaps a little bit more Willamette Valley classic in that it had rain. We're experiencing a little bit of rain this vintage, but I remind the team that we've had rain during vintage 8 out of the last 12 vintages. So it's just not atypical, and actually it's really sometimes a brilliant, a wonderful thing. And 17 was one of those things where it was a brilliant, wonderful thing to get a touch of rain, to slow things down a bit. Pardon me. We've been in, I mentioned earlier, we've been in a drying trend. We've also been in a warming trend, so since 2013, they've been warm and dry since 2013, just generally. And 17 was really no different, but 17 got this touch of rain, an inch and a half right at the right time, and lengthens things out. It gains more hang time. It refreshed everything. The roots needed it. We're about 95% dry farmed here, so we have a tiny bit of irrigation, but not much. And so, a drink like that was brilliant for hang time. One of the things we strive for here is trying to gain as much hang time as we possibly can without letting acids fall away. And of course, keeping an eye on sugars and potential alcohols. But, acid being key for us, there's a lot of savvy people on the call. Just quickly about Whole Bunch. There's so much leaching of potassium in the fermenter, even within the first 24 to 48 hours of soaking up, that there can be a rather dramatic pH shift in a fermenter. And so your acid your picking acid is just absolutely critical with your choice to use Whole Bunch, because we want our finished pHs to be 3.65 range, 3.7 range, with 5.5 to 5.8 grams per liter of TA. And we need low pH, very high acid at picking to achieve that. We also can add acid here as well, so we can add tartaric acid, and we do that. We do that if needed to taste, to really taste. But 17 is sort of a classic vintage, I think, also in its elegance here, from the Olamide Hills. I really love this in a juxtaposition side by side the 18s. This is it's going from just in the recent decade, one of the more elegant, just such a pretty, just a beautiful vintage in the 17s, just classic, just so elegant. The beautiful balance to a vintage that is a little bit more intense in its fruit profile. and a little bit more intense in its structure. Obviously much drier. But really, I think, you know, a wonderful juxtaposition, and showing you, I think, just in these 5 wines, a rather broad range of what the Willamette Valley can provide. It's a little bit difficult, I think, sometimes for consumers, because we do have such a variety in vintages. So just quickly, 2011 was the coolest vintage in Willamette Valley growing history. 2013 was the wettest growing vintage in Willamette Valley growing history. 15 the warmest, and 18 now the driest. So 11, 13, 15, 18, coldest, wettest, hottest, driest. And that's in the last, you know, 60 years of growing Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley. And so that's all within the last decade. So we can have this broad range, this variety of vintages. And so it's a little bit difficult for, I think, a consumer. It's not super consistent. You can go from just a rather lovely, you know, refined vintage to one that has a great deal of intensity and structure. I think that in cooler vintages, we see a lot more of the nuance. I see a lot more of the floral characteristics here that I was sort of describing previously, particularly with this vineyard. I think that what ends up happening, especially with a cooler vintage where you can elongate picking, you can slow picking down, is you just get so much more flavor development, obviously phenolic development, but there's a much greater separation of wines, a much greater separation. And what I mean by that is separation between blocks. So I've been describing a lot today about the differences between the depth of soil and the impacts of those on the wines. There's a much greater, more noticeable separation in cooler vintages. Much more noticeable to see how impactful and dark and brooding a shallow soil is, or a sedimentary soil is. And much more easy to see how pretty and elegant a deep, deep volcanic soil is in a cooler vintage. In a drier, warmer vintage, it's a little bit more compact. It's a little bit more difficult, I think, to sometimes see the nuance of personality and signature, but I think it's rewarded with patience. And I think we're seeing that with the 14s and 15s, which were much more, exceedingly warmer vintages than 18. And they showed similar things in their youth, where they were a bit tight in their youth. They were a bit spicy in their youth. And they were a bit compact, but where they unveiled themselves, they opened up over a period of a couple of years into showing really rather beautifully. The 15s, actually, particularly for me, which ended up being the warmest vintage in Willamette Valley growing history. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant vintage. I love what we ended up doing with it. It helped. We actually ended up changing some of our farming philosophies, again, because we have so much brilliance in our wine production team, our vineyard team. We actually went out and pulled leaves by hand in the canopies, removing leaves to actually slow the ripening down, and saw great success with that, great results with that, which we've been able to employ in other warmer vintages. But anyway, my point is I think with the 18s, you're going to be rewarded because I think they're going to get better and better and better as they unfold.
Tom, if I may interrupt, a couple of questions coming in.
Yeah,
one,
please.
Before we got on the line, you were extremely enthusiastic to talk about, but it's a wine that we're not tasting tonight. But it's the Chardonnay. It's the introduction of Daniel Estrin, his history of working with Ted Lemon of Rouleau and Littorai. It's something I can see super enthusiastic about. And are the UK going to get some Chardonnay? I know 19, you told me, was the first vintage. Can you assure us we'll be getting some, and tell us a little bit more? We haven't got a huge amount of time left, and we've got one. I know.
Forgive me for being so garrulous.
Tell us about Chardonnay, and then we'll crack into the Louise 17.
Okay, so quickly, Chardonnay at Cristom, we've been making Chardonnay since 1992, and it's from our very first vintage, from the get-go, and it's in our roots, it's in our blood. We began planting it very, very early, between 1993 and 1995 in Louise Vineyard, and so we still make a very small amount of Louise Vineyard Chardonnay. But we have been more focused on it over the last 5-6 years than ever before. I began planting it now in the Tom Gerrie vineyard. I began planting it now in the Eileen vineyard. And we're now sourcing fruit from a number of different vineyards as well. And we're really aiming to craft 2 wines at this time, maybe with an opportunity to craft more in the future, but I want a Louise Vineyard Chardonnay and a Yosemite Hills Chardonnay, a wine that really typifies our region. And really, we hired Daniel Estrin last year, July of 2019, out of Literai, working with Ted Lemon for the last, for 7 years before that, really for 2 reasons, well, many reasons. But really what he has taken on here in a tremendous fashion is the Chardonnay program, where we, for 28 years, have been trying to make world-class Pinot Noir. And frankly, I want that statement to be something like, we are aiming to grow, we are trying to grow world-class Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. I believe it can be done here. I know it can be done here. And I think with the introduction of Daniel's philosophies, Ted Lemon's philosophies, I'm seeing it in action. The 19 Chardonnay is truly exciting in tank. It's in tank now. It'll be bottled in January and released in the first quarter of next year. And it's the style that I really want. It's more acid driven. It's much more in balance with alcohol. So it's a little bit racy in style, but still beautiful balance and a creaminess and weight. It's lovely. I love the direction of where we're headed with Chardonnay. And, I really want a wine that is going to be a great companion wine to the Mount Jefferson Cuvée. And so it would be, in Yosemite Hills Chardonnay, as a representation of who we are, our philosophies, our style, our vision, and as a companion to our foundational wine, the Mount Jeff. But in that pretty racy, pretty acid-driven style is really what we're after. But obviously native yeast, obviously barrel fermented. But really, it's implementing really Ted's style here at Cristom, which I'm quite proud of.
This leaves you, Tom, with just 4 minutes to do.
Okay,
Louise.
so quickly about Louise 17.
Louise 17 justice.
So I think a bit more age on it here than the 18 that was just released. It's just showing so well. But what I love about this is that, so Louise, I sort of mentioned, has a sedimentary soil. It's lower on the hillside, so it's a touch warmer, 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer every day. Is shielded by the wind, so lower acids, a little bit touch higher pH. But there's still elegance here. Like, I think what I love about it is that, and I love these, what can present itself as a cooler vintage is that it still has a little bit of refinement here and an elegance and balance to it. But I think a lot of that can come from, even in a warm vintage like this, comes from that beautiful east-facing hillside, and then the very, very deep volcanic soils at the top of this vineyard. But it's much more red fruited than the 18. It's much more floral. It's much more effusive. It's jumping quite a bit more. Whereas I think the 18 is just a little bit quiet right now. But I really think that also in cooler vintages, whole cluster can be such a beautiful accent without being overpowering. You know, I mean, here it's just such a lovely spice that is, you know, cardamom and clove and cinnamon, just classic whole cluster spice, baking spice, but just such a beautiful accent to that high toned fruit. You know, I think the 18 is, you know, it needs some time to incorporate, but I think, you know, can handle a lot more whole bunch. The 18 was a touch more in whole cluster, a bit riper vintage, could handle a bit more. And so, you know, a bit more, even more structure there. Really quickly, I see in the chat a question about Marjorie. Marjorie was named for my grandmother and was our original vineyard. It was a vineyard that my father purchased. It was existing, it was here, own rooted, has phylloxera. We've been replanting it almost 20 years now. We discovered the phylloxera in the late 90s. And so most of the vines are about between 14 and 18 years old now. And really the defining character, very small production, very small production. And it doesn't get everywhere, certainly not anymore. But very small production relative to the other singles. But it's more about, I would just quickly say, it's about the palate presence and the texture. You know, it is by far the most textural wine on the farm. It's just almost an enveloping, coating tannin. So it's really rather lovely and distinctive in that nature. It's also very high toned, very bright, very red fruited, and very acid driven.
So on that note, I am going to unfortunately have to wrap things up. A huge thank you to you. Really interesting wines. I'm extremely passionate about myself, and yeah, huge thank you.
My pleasure. It was an honor to be here. Thank you for allowing me. Thank you for welcoming me, and my very best to you. I wish you all the best. So thank you for your time.